National Hurricane Center has downgraded Helene to a tropical storm less than a day after it made landfall in Florida's Big Bend region as a major Category 4 storm. At least 27 people have died across Florida, Georgia, and the Carolinas. Rescue crews in Florida have been working to rescue people trapped by floodwaters that are in some cases 9 feet deep. Meanwhile, residents in western North Carolina are being advised to evacuate after flooding put the Lake Lure Dam at imminent risk of failure. News Nation correspondent Xavier Walton rode the storm out in Florida, and he has the latest.
So we started our morning in Perry, Florida, about 10 miles away from where Helene made landfall, packing that powerful punch down trees on power lines. A big issue here, the story, storm surge. The estimates were supposed to be roughly 15 to 20. This is a boat ramp. Clearly it is no longer in the water. You see the boat here as we go around the shoreline. We'll talk about it. Even on top of buildings, the wind ripping the roof off there. And as you go across the shoreline, some areas here in Steinhatchee reportedly got upwards of a 12-foot storm surge. You see some of the damage here. Some of the boating ramps and boating docks, pieces of it, littering this small town community. Some going 4 to 5 blocks away from where we are. That's because the storm surge was so high. Another big issue here, not just the storm surge, obviously the water certainly has receded, power outages. This entire community still without power. From Steinhatchee, Xavier Walton, News Nation.
Thank you, Xavier, and I hope you and everyone else in that region stays safe.
For nearly 4 years, we have been living through the worst border crisis in the history of the world. There's never been anything like it, which has brought untold suffering, misery, and death upon our land. The architect of this destruction is Kamala Harris.
Former President Donald Trump there taking a swing at Vice President Harris ahead of her visit today to the US-Mexico border in Arizona. This will be Harris's first visit to the border in more than 3 years, and that itself is a focus of criticism for Republicans as they seek to bind the Vice President as tightly as possible to the Biden administration's record on immigration. With just weeks away until Election Day, this could be a crucial visit as Harris tries to toughen up her image on what many call a crisis at the border. She also wants to focus her attacks on Trump's role in tanking a bipartisan border bill. Joining us now, the Hill staff writer, Rafael Bernal. Rafael, what do we expect from this visit by the Vice President today?
I think the key word for the Vice President's campaign is tough. She wants to seem tough on the border. She's got an ad called Tough. She wants to lean in to her as a former law enforcement officer, as Attorney General of California, and she's also looking to reframe what border security means, reframe it a little bit away from immigration and reframe it into what are we doing because of the cartels at the border? What are we doing to stop trafficking of humans, guns, drugs, you name it? Mm-hmm. So that reframing, it seeks to thread the needle, two things. It seeks to not open up too much her left flank, like not seem tough on immigrants, seem tough on the border specifically, and at the same time go after those independent voters in places like Arizona who really want more border security.
In terms of that effort to thread the needle, the number of unauthorized border crossings has really plummeted in recent months. It's gone down by about 2/3 since it hit an all-time high in December. So with those numbers declining so much, is there really a need for tougher border restrictions?
That's a great question. Probably not. There's a need to institutionalize a lot of what has worked, because let's remember what changed the equation at the border was, first of all, Mexican enforcement went way up. Mexicans have their own reason for wanting to collaborate with the Biden administration on this. And the other thing is part of those measures toughening up against asylum that were in that bipartisan Senate deal, the parts that the administration believed could be done by executive action, they went ahead and did it. So they have to really figure out what works and what doesn't. But I mean, throwing more money at it arguably might not be the smartest way to invest that money.
Speaking of, what happened earlier this year with the proposal, it did sort of underscore what a partisan issue this is, because even though that proposal emerged from a bipartisan process, Republicans then killed it, partly at the behest of former President Trump. Given that it is such a polarized issue, is it realistic to expect that the Vice President, if she were elected, could in fact enact her plans?
Oh, I don't think that particular deal is going to be enacted because it wasn't only. It's not only polarizing across the aisle. It was polarizing among Democrats. I've talked to Congressional Hispanic Caucus Chairwoman Nanette Barragan, and she keeps saying, we were not in the room when this supposedly bipartisan deal was made, and it affects Latino constituents more, or disproportionately more than the general population. So whenever we do see any border deal or immigration deal, and it seems like these two issues are finally being separated, you will see a Congressional Hispanic Caucus that more aggressively says we need to be in the room. And if they are in the room, those anti-asylum measures are maybe will be in there, but will certainly be watered down.
One Arizona-specific question before we let you go, Rafael. It is interesting in the election that former President Trump seems to have a narrow lead over Vice President Harris in the state. But on the other hand, in the Senate race, the Democratic nominee, Ruben Gallego, is up over Republican candidate Carrie Lake by about 7 points or thereabouts. What do you put that disconnect down to?
What I'm seeing, it's probably down to two things. Candidate quality. Former President Trump, a lot of people like him. Carrie Lake, the same cannot be said for her. And the other thing is Gallego's own figure. Gallego, who was moved to the center, but he's a former Marine. He's a man, and that actually might be, and a lot of strategists I've talked to think that's part of what's a deciding factor for older conservative Latino male voters. That just, it might be identity politics working in favor of Gallego in this case.
So that's just briefly, that's an interesting point. The suspicion, or suspicion's perhaps too loaded a term, there is a theory that older, more socially conservative Latino men might be reluctant to vote for a woman.
Right, and that basically, there's no such thing as a Trump-Gallego voter, there's a Gallego-Trump voter. Just who doesn't want to vote for Kamala Harris for many identity reasons, for many policy reasons, and is attracted to Gallego because of who he is and his personality and his background.
Fascinating stuff. Rafael Bernal, thanks for joining us.
A pleasure.
We have a very good relationship. And I also have a very good relationship, as you know, with President Putin. And I think if we win, I think we're going to get it resolved very quickly. I really think we're going to get it resolved.
I hope we have more good relations.
We're going to have, I see. Yeah, but it takes two to tango, and
An awkward moment there between former President Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. The two met Friday morning after clashing recently on social media and at rallies. Earlier this week, Zelenskyy called Trump's running mate, J.D. Vance, too radical. Trump responded, accusing the Ukrainian president of refusing to make a deal to end the war with Russia and of making, quote, little nasty aspersions against him. Joining us now with more on their conversation is national political reporter and author of the Hill's 1230 report, Cate Martel. Cate, thanks for joining us here. I was watching the body language in that clip. Those two guys seem to have a somewhat strained relationship. Why did they meet today and what came out of it?
Yeah, I would say that was a bit of a strained relationship. Watching that interaction was incredibly awkward. How did they have this meeting? I'm pretty surprised myself that meeting did occur after the series of events that happened this week that started with Ukrainian President Zelenskyy doing an interview with The New Yorker and referring to Trump's running mate as too radical. That set off this series of events and this, pretty big spat with House Republicans on Capitol Hill. So I am fairly surprised that happened. I think the reason that this meeting happened is for former President Trump to look more presidential. You have to acknowledge the fact that his running mate, Vice President Harris, was able to meet with Zelenskyy yesterday in her official capacity. That carries a lot of weight. And while former President Trump does have more of a populist, isolationist view when it comes to Ukraine, I think that does factor in him having the meeting. But as we mentioned, this was so incredibly tense that I don't think it necessarily helped. That, by having the meeting might have been one step forward, but then you saw those interactions, I'd say another step back. So I'd say overall as a net neutral, Niall.
Fair enough. So switching gears back to the mechanics of the election, we're obviously just weeks away from Election Day, but officials in North Carolina, they've just recently announced nearly 750,000 names have been removed from voter rolls since the midterms in 2022. Cate, can you just talk us through what that's all about?
Yeah, it's a pretty big number when you talk about how many people were removed off the state election voter roll calls in North Carolina. There are only 7.7 million registered voters now in North Carolina. Most of these numbers that were removed from the voter roll calls are actually from people who moved within the state in North Carolina, but never actually registered for their new address. That's a big cause for them. And another major cause is people who have not voted in the past 2 federal elections. They've been deemed inactive. There are also certain other factors, people who have been convicted of a felony, people who have died, there's other personal reasons. But what we've heard from the state is that the 2 main reasons are people who are deemed inactive because they have not voted in past elections, and people who have moved within the state and have not switched to their new address yet.
And of course, North Carolina has 16 votes in the Electoral College. Those are still up for grabs. Right now, Decision Desk HQ showing Vice President Harris less than a point behind former President Trump. So given the numbers, could those voter roll purges impact who wins the Tar Heel state in November?
It's hard to say, Niall, how that will play out and who those voters, on which side that they will affect more. But I will say that in the past few days, we've learned that former President Trump's ground game is trying to court voters who have not been considered reliable voters in the past few elections. And it could potentially impact them if they're deemed inactive and no longer registered to vote. It's a big if whether that ground game strategy that Trump's campaign is making will be effective. But if it is, that could potentially have an effect in the state. But as we've pointed out, that there's likely 7-ish swing states that will probably determine the outcome of the election. And North Carolina is one of those. And Democrats are certainly working the state and are hoping that Harris can win on the presidential level.
Now, moving elsewhere in the South, as you say, there are 7 battleground states, one of them being Georgia. A new Bloomberg News Morning Consult poll shows Harris and Trump tied in that state with 49% support apiece. So look, the Peach State was obviously thought at one time to be deep red, but Biden flipped it back to blue back in 2020. Does Kamala Harris have a realistic chance of holding the state, of keeping it Democratic blue?
She does have a chance. And, every poll that we keep seeing shows this major trend of how incredibly close it is. And it could go in either direction. I think it's fascinating to look at when Vice President Harris is visiting the state of Georgia. She's really focusing on reproductive rights and speaking to voters who are really impassioned by women's reproductive rights when they're voting at the ballot box. And that could effectively help her, I think, in November, that Georgia has a very strict anti-abortion law. And those are voters that she's hoping to speak to. Now, as you mentioned, Biden did flip the state in 2020. So I think it's entirely possible that she does win, but poll after poll, it just swings slightly back and forth, that the two are so incredibly tied that it could really come down to early voting, and it could come down to other small factors in the state on Election Day.
Let me go to something else, a matter of a degree of sort of political intrigue here, Cate. One of the biggest fundraising groups for Senate Republicans, the Senate Leadership Fund, it says it is withholding funding from the campaigns of Texas Senator Ted Cruz and Florida Senator Rick Scott. Now, both Cruz and Scott, as you well know, have been among Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell's biggest, strongest critics. And in the meantime, Senate Democrats are pouring money into both those races. So what do we make of this, Cate? Is this Mitch McConnell snubbing his critics, or are Republicans just confident that they don't need to spend the money because the states are going to stay red?
Niall, we have seen a lot of grumbling from conservatives over Senators Rick Scott and Ted Cruz not being favored. Now, I think it's interesting to look back at when Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell back in February spoke with The Hill. He says, we do not favor any candidates on the Republican side. Our whole goal here is to keep the chamber. But we have seen that many Republicans are privately saying they think that he has the ability to sway. And while you look at Texas and Florida, and they do seem like fairly Republican states, Democrats are targeting both of those states. It certainly favors Republicans, but it's not a given at all. And that's why we're starting to see Democrats pump more money into the state. And I think that's why we're seeing some Republicans pushing back and grumbling over the fact that Mitch McConnell has so much power in what happens with Senate Republican fundraising.
Great insights, Cate. Great to have you with us. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Niall.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addressed world leaders in a fiery speech at the United Nations General Assembly, vowing to continue Israel's assault on Hamas and Hezbollah until both are destroyed.
This war can come to an end now. All that has to happen is for Hamas to surrender, lay down its arms, and release all the hostages. But if they don't, we will fight until we achieve victory, total victory. There is no substitute for it. Israel must also defeat Hezbollah in Lebanon. Hezbollah is the quintessential terror organization in the world today.
The Prime Minister also used his address to warn Iran about any future escalation or direct attacks on Israel.
I have a message for the tyrants of Tehran. If you strike us, we will strike you. There is no place in Iran that the long arm of Israel cannot reach. And that's true of the entire Middle East.
Dozens of diplomats were seen walking out ahead of the Israeli Prime Minister's address. They were doing so, of course, in protest against Israel's actions, which have killed tens of thousands of Palestinians in Gaza in the 11 months since the October 7th attacks. Netanyahu also appears willing to risk a full-scale war in Lebanon. Shortly after he wrapped up his speech, large explosions in Beirut hit the central headquarters of Hezbollah, and that attack coming at the end of an intense week of Israeli airstrikes inside Lebanon. New York City Mayor Eric Adams has pled not guilty to federal bribery, conspiracy and campaign finance charges. Adams is accused of accepting more than $100,000 in gifts as a trade-off, a bribe essentially, to use his political influence to help the nation of Turkey. A defiant Adams is maintaining his innocence, vowing to fight the charges and rejecting calls to step down during a press conference Thursday, as a slew of hecklers and disgruntled New Yorkers drowned out the mayor's words. New York Representative Jerry Nadler has become the most senior congressional lawmaker to call for Adams to resign. Similar calls have come from other New York representatives, including Congresswomen Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Nicole Maliotakis. The New York Times editorial board has called on Adams to resign amid the charges, saying that the mayor should not, quote, force New York City to wait for him to prove his innocence under the law. A Secret Service staffing shortage is forcing former President Trump's rally in Wisconsin to move to a smaller venue. Trump's campaign scrapped plans to hold a rally outdoors at an airport in Wisconsin, opting instead for a smaller indoor arena in Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin. The Secret Service says it did not have the personnel needed to secure the site due to the competing demands of the United Nations General Assembly meeting in New York. The change comes as Secret Service has bolstered its protection of Trump after the former president faced 2 assassination attempts within just 60 days. Politicians and elected officials have called for more funding for the Secret Service in the wake of those attempted attacks. And just this week, Congress approved $231 million for the agency. A New York appeals court is signalling skepticism over the $464 million judgment against former President Trump and his business in a civil fraud case. A 5-judge panel grilled both Trump and state attorneys during a hearing yesterday, questioning the size of the penalty and the scope of the Attorney General's authority to bring forward the case. Trump's appeal will likely be adjudicated in the coming months, but importantly, experts say it is unlikely a decision will be made before Election Day. Wednesday's hearing is yet another twist in the string of legal cases playing out for Trump as Election Day grows closer. The former president's lawyers have also argued to vacate the guilty verdict in his New York criminal case, dismiss the federal election interference case in DC, and overturn the E. Jean Carroll defamation verdict. When voters head to the polls in November, they'll of course be voting up and down the ballot. But the presidential election will be won or lost in the Electoral College process, something which dates back to our founding fathers. In today's Political Minute, Blake Berman, News Nation's chief Washington correspondent and the moderator of The Hill, takes us through the Electoral College process from Election Day to the inauguration.
The path to becoming the president. I'm Blake Berman with News Nation. Election Day kicks off a process as old as the Constitution. The Electoral College has 538 electors. Now, each state has a certain number of Electoral College votes to cast. To win, a candidate must get 270. On November 5th, voters make their choices at the polls. Then on December 11th, states appoint electors. About a week later, those electors then cast their votes for the candidate who won their state. But in Nebraska and in Maine, the electoral votes are also divided by congressional district. Those votes must be received by the United States Senate here in Washington by December 25th. And on January 6th, Congress counts them up. The new president is then inaugurated on January 20th. Inauguration Day, by the way, is just 4 months away. I'm Blake Berman, and this is the News Nation Political Minute.
You can find more news and analysis from Blake and our colleagues on News Nation. To find News Nation on your screen, go to joinnn.com. That's today's Daily Debrief. I'm Niall Stanage. Be sure to like, share and subscribe to The Hill's fantastic YouTube channel, and come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.